Hello, I'm Lucas. This is a bit of lit, and this is part 3 of John Steinbeck's East of Eden for maybe Midrash, where we read two works of literature that are in conversation with religion, one fiction, one nonfiction. And I want to talk about John Steinbeck's East of Eden a little bit more in depth, which is why I've been making this in 4 parts. And I'm going to give a little bit less of a plot breakdown. A lot of Hamiltons die in this chapter. First Una, and then Samuel, and then Desi, and then Joe. But other characters die, or other characters we hear about dying. Charles dies. We learn about how Lee's mother died when she came over secretly with Lee's father to build railroads so they wouldn't be separated because she was pregnant with Lee. And, through some of these events, Adam goes back and forth in meeting Cathy. Both times he drives her insane. One time to see her, and another time to give the half of the money of Charles that he willed to Cathy. And she can't understand. She can't see the good in people. She only sees evil. She only sees the worst. And it just sort of breaks her in a way. She, claws out. What I want to talk about in particular is the most important theme of choice in this thing. We've had the framework built up with Adam and Eve and original sin and Cain and Abel, and we've been told how these stories follow us, and we've had these ideas of good and evil at odds with each other. We've seen it with Charles and Adam. We've seen in the very first chapter with the mountains and the wet and dry seasons, just putting the impression of opposites. We've seen it with Adam and Cathy through these 3 parts, because Adam is kind of Adam is not a great person. He's a nice, kind person, I guess, but he's neglectful of his children. And Cathy, she's just pure evil. And as I talked about last time, what is interesting is that a lot of those things are, she never told anybody. Nobody asked her. And if she did tell someone, I don't want to do that, they didn't listen to her. And a lot of the things that she says, I don't want to do that, are seen as evil and portrayed as evil, but they are also feminine expectations that she rejects. Marriage, giving birth, and being a mother. She rejects all of those. She tries to abort her children. She leaves her children, and she leaves Adam to become a prostitute. We've seen some other characters making some interesting choices. Lee, he puts on an affect of a Chinese person in America, but if he's in China, people reject him. If he's in America and he acts like his regular self, he gets rejected in a way. And some of these characters, it seems like they don't have a choice. I mean, they make choices, no doubt. I'm not saying that I think the first 3 parts, the characters really don't make choices themselves, largely to fit the theme. I think in the 4th part, which takes a little bit too long to get to, where the characters feel like real people, making real choices, and it just so happens that all these choices culminating up to tragedy are culminating up to tragedy. So yeah, if you've been reading along, maybe you disagree, but it feels to me that, these characters are very much archetypes of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve. Now maybe our Eve is taking things really far in the sort of opposite direction, but she's still an archetype. And they're acting within that because he needs it to go that way for the plot. And then when we finally get to the best part of the book, which is part 4, then it feels like, okay, I have all this in my mind about who they are and why they act the way they do. And then part 4 is where the magic actually happens, which is a little bit too long, but it's the last third of the book. And the characters start to feel like they really make a choice. But we're talking about part 3, where choice is introduced with a name, sort of. We've seen it a little bit in the first 2 parts, but part 3 is now where we're talking about it. And it's when Samuel comes to visit, and he has a conversation with Lee. Let's see, where is it? They are talking about, and it is a terribly written conversation, in my opinion, but it brings up a very important theme. Let's see. Do you remember when you read us the 16 verses of the 4th chapter of Genesis and we argued about them? Who says something like that, honestly? I do indeed, and that's a long time ago. 10 years nearly. Anyway, he goes on to, talk about this really bothered me, and I was reading King James Version, but then I read another version, and there's some discrepancies there with some of the language from that story of Cain and Abel. And, he went to San Francisco to talk to the name registry Chinese people. And discuss it with them, and they studied Greek and Hebrew and all this stuff and came to an answer after a couple of years. Anyway, the King James Version says this is Lee. It is when Jehovah has asked Cain why he is angry, Jehovah says, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. It was the thou shalt that struck me, because it was a promise that Cain would conquer sin. And then, we get the other translation that he's talking about is the American Standard Bible, which says, do thou rule over him. Now this is very different. This is not a promise. It is an order. And it's very interesting to see how that, how the translation changes the meaning. Because he's right. Thou shalt means that, it's a promise. Eventually, in time, you will overcome sin. Whereas do thou is a command. It's like you better overcome sin on your own, or there's going to be trouble. Now, he continues, thou shalt and do thou, and this was the gold from our mining, when they're trying to figure out where is the crux of this translation change. Thou mayest rule over sin. The old gentleman smiled and nodded and felt the years were well spent. It brought them out of their Chinese shells, too, and right now they are studying Greek. Anyway, a little bit later, the American Standard Translation orders men to triumph over sin, and you can call sin ignorance. The King James Translation makes a promise in thou shalt, meaning that men will surely triumph over sin. But the Hebrew word, the word timshal, thou mayest, that gives a choice. It might be the most important word in the world. That says the way is open. That throws it right back on a man. For if thou mayest, it is also true that thou mayest not. Don't you see? And yeah, we are going to be talking a lot about timshal and thou mayest, and making a choice to overcome sin, to move past the mistakes that you've made and garner forgiveness. And yeah, it's gonna be interesting because part 4 is actually really good, whereas the rest of the book is good. I love part 4. So yeah, we will talk about that next time. Thank you. Goodbye.